This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by NordVPN. Upgrade your online protection with an all-in-one security app.
It was April 6, 1814, and after years of warfare and panic over Napoleon Bonaparte, events had finally turned against the emperor. Outnumbered and deposed, he abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba, and for a moment it appeared that the crisis that had overwhelmed Europe for years was over. But the allies of the Sixth Coalition found out that absent opposition to Napoleon, they had little in common, and while they bickered, he plotted his return. The details of Napoleon's escape and the beginning of the 100 Days deserves to be remembered.
In the first week of April, 1814, Napoleon's fortunes had finally and fully reversed. Paris had fallen on March 31st, and on April 2nd, the French Senate officially deposed him. The Allies had promised that their quarrel was not with France as a whole, but with Napoleon alone, and that the French nation would remain. Tsar Alexander also announced that 150,000 captured French held in Russia were to be released. For a short time, Napoleon still considered fighting on. When he got news that he had been deposed, he attempted to abdicate in favor of his son and leave his wife, Marie-Louise, regent. But the Allies rejected the idea. A regency with the Empress and her son sounds well, I admit, Alexander wrote, but Napoleon remains. Napoleon had no choice but unconditional abdication. Over the next few days, the Treaty of Fontainebleau was negotiated, and Napoleon came out of the disaster relatively well. He was deposed as Emperor of France, but the treaty gave him the island of Elba as a principality. It also allowed him to continue to use the title Emperor. The family was well covered financially, with Napoleon given 2.5 million francs a year and Marie-Louise given several Italian duchies. He was allowed to keep a small force of around 700 men as a personal guard. The Allies also promised to defend the island from Barbary pirates. Even after he abdicated, there were ominous signs that his story was not yet over. On April 7th, 40,000 soldiers at Fontainebleau paraded in the night, carrying torches and yelling, "Vive l'Empereur!" Some soldiers even fired at their officers in Lille.
I've been a NordVPN subscriber for years, and of course I love how NordVPN protects my data and also how I can use its multiple servers worldwide to get better access to streaming content. A VPN is really a must-have, but things change, and modern-day cyber threats require a more robust response. And that's why NordVPN has evolved into an all-in-one digital security powerhouse, combining the world's leading VPN with next-generation antivirus to protect users from scams, fake shops, everyday threats. Upgrade your online protection with an all-in-one security app. Get an exclusive NordVPN offer plus additional 4 months by going to nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy. And of course, it's all risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee. This is an all-in-one digital security app. One subscription gets you multiple tools to protect yourself from everyday threats like phishing attacks, scams, and malware. Many traditional antiviruses don't actually do anything until the malicious file is already on your device. But NordVPN seeks to intercept these threats at the source and do things like identify fake stores or scam websites, neutralize phishing links, or block malware in downloading files. And with NordVPN's dark web monitor, you immediately get an alert if your leaked data appears on a dark web marketplace. And that gives you time to change the locks on your digital house. And of course, you get all this on up to 10 devices, on all major platforms, all on the same subscription. So upgrade your online protection to an all-in-one digital security app. Get a special NordVPN deal plus an additional 4 months by going to nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy. And of course, it's all risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee.
Napoleon was not, however, very optimistic, and even tried to poison himself the night of April 12th. A physician induced vomiting to save him. Marie-Louise refused to go into exile with him. Later, he would say that he had no great expectation of ever coming back to France. When he left Fontainebleau on April 20th, he did so in front of the Old Guard, the most prestigious and veteran troops of his army. He bid them an adieu in an emotional speech. All Europe was unified against us, he told them, but nonetheless he would have fought on. He claimed that he chose not to because civil war would have torn the soil of our beautiful country. He ended his speech by embracing the French flag. Napoleon was brought to the tiny island of Elba, about 86 square miles, aboard HMS Undaunted. He was cheered as he left, which English Captain Thomas Usher found in the highest degree interesting. Napoleon arrived in his gilded cage at Elba on May 3rd, and there too he met cheers of Vive l'Empereur. They raised the island's new flag, and Napoleon, remarkably, picked out a man from the crowd, a sergeant to whom he had awarded the Cross of Legion years prior. For at least a short time, Napoleon seemed serious about ruling Elba, throwing himself into its administration. He made efforts to secure a better income for the island's natural iron resources. Despite the treaty, the Bourbons in France never actually paid him a centime of his supposed annual income, and the island's own income couldn't match his outflow. He called his little island the Operetta Kingdom, but nonetheless quickly set about improving the island's defenses, built a fountain, a hospital, and planted vineyards. All the while he paid scrupulous attention to events as they were unfolding in Europe. He paid so close attention that in October 1814 a letter was sent suggesting that he was considering a return. A single British ship, HMS Partridge, watched the island, and he was allowed the 16-gun L'Inconstant as the flagship of the Elba Navy. In Europe, victory provided a small reprieve from the conflict. The Congress of Vienna, which began on September 15th, sought to redraw the map of all Europe, and disagreements quickly bubbled to the surface. Even before it began, Alexander of Russia was insulted when French diplomat Talleyrand was given a seat at the table after the Allies had agreed to leave France out of the negotiations. The various powers had competing desires. Russia wanted control over an independent Poland, and for Prussia to gain Saxony. Austria opposed both of those. Talleyrand's goal was to preserve as much of France's gains as possible, naturally at odds with everyone else. When the British sided with France and Austria, Alexander said, "I shall be king of Poland, and the king of Prussia shall be king of Saxony." Alexander then reminded Britain that he had nearly 500,000 soldiers in the region, and the British were free to try to dislodge them. According to the book Waterloo, New Perspectives by David Hamilton Williams, war clouds seemed to be gathering over the conference. As negotiations deadlocked, Prussia considered occupying Saxony, and Austria retorted that they would resist by force if necessary. The Tsar even challenged Austrian diplomat Clement von Metternich to a duel. As all of the powers gathered troops on January 3, 1815, and Britain and Austria signed a secret treaty of alliance in case of war. The returning Bourbons were making their own problems in France. Louis XVIII had agreed to sign a charter promising more civil liberty, but ultimately defanged the charter with a revised version. When Napoleon abdicated, he had refused to give up any territory. The Bourbons agreed to return to France's 1791 borders, shrinking the kingdom from 109 departments to 87. Wealthy royalists returned to seize their land back. The Catholic Church regained significant power, and taxes were raised. Pensions were cut, even for wounded veterans. The 1786 trade agreement with the British was re-established, which lowered tariffs and even abolished some, hurting French manufacturers. The British chose Wellington as ambassador to France, and Napoleon wrote that the appointment must be very galling to the army, as must the great attention shown to him by the king. It was the army that was perhaps most impacted by bad Bourbon policy. The tricolor was discarded for the traditional white flag and fleur-de-lis, and the Legion d'Honneur was downgraded behind royal orders. The Imperial Guard was replaced with a new Household Guard, while the Middle Guard was totally abolished. Officers were aggressively retired, put on half pay. My first hope came when I saw in the gazettes that at the banquet at the Hôtel de Ville, there were the wives of the nobility only, and none of those of officers of the army, Napoleon said. Soldiers defied orders and celebrated on August 15, 1814, Napoleon's birthday. When British writer William Crackenthorpe visited that year, he wrote that he doubt not that he breathed vengeance within himself against us for having come to see him in his humility. Napoleon also was facing unhappiness. His wife and child would not come to Elba, and rumors flowed that the Allies planned to take even Elba away from him, possibly exiling him to Botany Bay or St. Helena. He felt that had he been killed, his place in history would be assured, but my late reverses will efface all the glory of my early years. The possibility he would be assassinated hung over him. The British observer on Elba, Neil Campbell, wrote to the Continent that if the money promised wasn't sent, I considered him capable of any desperate step. Campbell would repeat the warning in subsequent letters. Tsar Alexander would later castigate the French. Why should we expect him to keep his word with us? We did not do so with him. In February of 1815, the Baron Fleury du Chaboulon visited him at Elba, telling him that France was ripe for his return. He told them that when soldiers were forced to say Vive le Roi, they often said under their breath, de Rome, meaning Napoleon's young son. And so they still love me? Napoleon asked. Yes, sire, de Chablon said, and may I venture to say more than ever. Napoleon still believed that he could have won after the fall of Paris, if not for the betrayal of the French general Auguste de Marmont, who had defected to the Royalists in the final hours of the war. His mother told him that he must go. It is your destiny to do so. You were not made to die on this desert island. On February 16th, Campbell left on HMS Partridge upon a short excursion to the continent for my health. When Campbell arrived, the British deputy in Florence dismissed Campbell's fears. When you return to Elba, you may tell Bonaparte that he is quite forgotten in Europe. No one thinks of him now. Napoleon, however, took his chance, outfitting the Inconstant and painting it Royal Navy colors. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon left aboard his 300-ton ship, accompanied by a handful of smaller vessels and 607 Old Guard grenadiers. Paris or death, they cried. Also along were 108 Polish lancers without horses, a Corsican battalion of fewer than 300, 50 gendarmes, and 2 light cannon. This tiny group was the force with which Napoleon proposed to recapture France. When he landed on the French coast on March 1st, he told his men, I have long weighed and most maturely considered the project. The glory, the advantages we shall gain if we succeed, I need not enlarge upon. If we fail, to military men who have from their youth faced death in so many shapes, the fate which awaits us is not terrific, we know, and we despise, for we have 1,000 times faced the worse which a reverse can bring. Aboard the ship he had produced 2 proclamations, which had been hastily copied aboard the ships. He said that his heart had been torn apart by the fall of Paris, and so he had accepted exile for the sake of his country. But he could not watch Louis XVIII return the kingdom to feudal government of yesteryear. In my exile I heard your complaints and wishes. You were claiming the government of your choice, which alone is legitimate. You were blaming me for my long sleep. You were reproaching me for sacrificing to my repose the greater interests of the state. He had returned, amid all sorts of dangers, to regain my rights, which are yours. In a matter of a few days, Napoleon had accomplished the impossible. He had escaped his exile and returned to France. But he faced a royalist stronghold and stood no chance if anyone discovered him before he could rebuild an army. He moved rapidly along the Alps to Grenoble, moving 190 miles in 6 days. Despite opportunity, his way was not blocked. The bridges were not destroyed. A famous legend says that when he ran into a battalion of the 5th Line, he threw off his gray overcoat, pointed to his breast, and asked if they wished to fire on their emperor, and the men immediately embraced him. Another version of events is told by General Savary, who wasn't present. He claims that the men of the line aimed their muskets, but that Napoleon approached asking how they were doing. I've come back to see you, he said. Do some of you want to kill me? Napoleon himself said he went forward and held out my hand to a soldier, saying, What, you old rascal, were you about to fire on your emperor? At Grenoble, the 7th Line joined him, and the people tore down their city gates, presenting pieces as a sign of their loyalty. On my march from Caen to Grenoble, I was an adventurer. In Grenoble, I once again became a sovereign, Napoleon said. General Michael Ney, who had left Paris with the intention to fight Napoleon, said later that his defection was due to being caught in the midst of storms. He said his men were so fervently in support of the emperor that he could not hold back the sea with my hands. On March 20th, Napoleon entered Paris, de facto emperor once again. The Moniteur newspaper wrote that the jubilation cannot be described.
It was an audacious and, as it appeared in March of 1815, magnificently successful operation. Just 11 months earlier, Napoleon's generals had been abandoning him, and Paris was lost. And that he was able to return so quickly, with such ease, and such fanfare, despite the fact that it had taken the efforts of virtually all of Europe to defeat him just a year before, seemed almost unbelievable. Of course, it didn't last. The diplomats at the Congress of Vienna realized the significance of the crisis and were able to quickly resolve through diplomatic means, though not necessarily entirely happily, their outstanding issues, and by March 13th declare that Napoleon was an enemy and disturber of the tranquility of the world. And just 3 months later, the armies of the 7th Coalition would put an end to one of the greatest comebacks in history. A loss so historic that even today, if a person faces a final and crushing defeat, they are said to have, like Napoleon, met their Waterloo. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. Really good. You're really, really good. I love you, handsome.